On YouTube, it's a common practice to analyze villains from movies, TV shows, books, etc. Usually these videos will explain the tragedy of their character, or what makes them so endearing to watch, or even why they are so horribly despicable. One famous channel that falls under this example is The Vile Eye, known for its series Analyzing Evil, with the channel in question having over 900,000 subscribers. Despite the series' popularity, however, there isn't really a proper counterpart to this to cover the opposite, characters who are heroic. It's kind of odd because it's true in general that despite their impact on general culture, not as many heroic characters and their actions tend to really be talked about in the same depth. There are some characters who are talked about somewhat frequently, like Spider-Man. However, it's more so the exception than it is the norm, though it's an incredibly important thing to consider, as while it is also important to consider the evil implications of some characters and how they reflect with examples of people in the real world. It's also good to see how others act morally, and how people can apply this philosophy to ourselves in our daily lives. So I thought maybe I could try and apply my own personal take on the idea, calling it Analyzing Benevolence. The only problem with this idea is that I don't really know where to start. I had a few ideas, but ultimately what gave me the idea for this current iteration was Analyzing Evil's first video, which is about Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now, a man who is horribly traumatized by war and commits awful crimes in his own deranged attempt to try and end it. While an evil character, more than anything, Kurtz's character was more so meant to be depicted as a broken human who is doing everything he can to try and justify the awful things he has seen and his fear of it. An incredibly sympathetic character in that case. So, I thought for the first iteration of my idea, I'd take a look at something sort of the same but also the opposite. A game featuring moral dilemmas and characters with ultimately good intentions, but also counteracted by evil actions, that being Slay the Princess. Now, admittingly, the title does not sound very benevolent, and well, you'd be half right. The game is, as the title suggests, about contemplating murdering a princess. However, the game is also about all the good in this evil as well, and how in the end, a lot of morality is simply perspective and can change depending on view, and how opposing certain traditions or rules may be the start of something new. If you haven't beaten or even played the game, that might come off as odd, confusing, and maybe even a little bit pretentious. However, I do believe that these are the themes that are present within the game's narrative, though I'm talking ahead of myself and getting to the points before they're relevant, because despite its simple premise, there is a lot to unpack in this game, both in terms of horror, science fiction concepts, and most importantly, the morality of choices, and picking our own paths, and how it all ties back to our own lives and how we decide to live them. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Analyzing Benevolence, where we'll be talking about Slay the Princess. Okay, so before we start the video, I want to say two things. Firstly, if you made it this far already, thank you very much. It means a lot. I'm still very new to this. I am new to recording. I'm new to the general script writing. And a lot of this has just been ideas in my head for like the past year. So, it might come off as very amateur, and I apologize in advance if it does. I'll try and improve in the future. But either way, thank you a million. It really does mean a lot. Second of all, originally during the beginning portion, I was going to mention a YouTuber who did a series somewhat similar to what I'm doing right now. However, I've learned that The Vile Eye doesn't really want to talk about him and mention him. And he's also very controversial. Like, not super well known, but it's still controversial to where it's like, I looked into it and it's like, yeah, it would be better if I didn't mention him by name. If you know who I'm talking about, then you know who I'm talking about. But either way, that's that. I just wanted to address that. But anyway, regardless, thank you everybody too who's watching, and I really do hope you enjoy the video. And if you have any thoughts about it, let me know. Whether it's critique, positive things to say, criticism, yada yada yada, all that stuff. Like, subscribe, yada, yada, you get the idea. Thank you very much. In the very beginning of the game, you hear the voice of a narrator speaking to you. He states that,
"You're on a path in the woods, and at the end of that path is a cabin. and in the basement of that cabin is a princess. You're here to slay her. If you don't, it will be the end of the world.
From the very second that the game starts, it brings up a bizarre moral dilemma. Ending the life of a princess you know nothing about, or seeing the entirety of the world end. Very similar situation at the trolley problem, and the dilemma presented in that. In the original interpretation of the trolley problem, Philippa Foot states the hypothetical and a few others with, suppose that a judge or magistrate is faced with rioters demanding that a culprit be found for a certain crime, and threatening otherwise to take their bloody revenge on a particular section of the community. The real culprit being unknown, the judge sees himself as being able to prevent the bloodshed only by framing some innocent person and having him executed. Beside this example is placed another in which a pilot whose aeroplane is about to crash is deciding whether to steer from a more to less inhabited area. To make a parallel as close as possible, it may rather be supposed that he is the driver of a runaway tram, which he can only steer from one narrow track to another. 5 men are working on one track and 1 man on the other. Anyone working on the track he enters is bound to be killed. In the case of the rioters, the mobs have 5 hostages, so in both, the exchange is supposed to be 1 man's life for the lives of 5. Now, why do I bring up this comparison, other than to mention it to the few people who have somehow not heard of the trolley problem? Well, because in the same text, Philippa Foot brings up why this is a problem to begin with. The question is why we should say, without hesitation, the driver should steer for the less occupied track. While most of us would be appalled at the idea that the innocent man could be framed, it may be suggested that the special feature of the latter case is that it involves a corruption of justice, and this is, of course, very important indeed. But if we remove that special feature, supposing that some private individual is to kill an innocent person and pass him off as a criminal, we still find ourselves horrified by the idea. The idea of the framed man is especially true here, as we basically know nothing about the situation or who this woman is. You're not even sure if the world will actually end due to this lady, or if that's simply a lie. But it's also an extremely heavy risk to take due to someone being named the Narrator suggesting it. With that in mind, how the gameplay of Slay the Princess works is that every so often you get a few choices. Explorer choices usually are there specifically to gain more context in this situation or just to ask questions, while the other choices are there just for you to make your decision. When taking the Explorer choices in this beginning section, you get very little information. For example, when asking, but how can a princess locked away in a basement end the world, you get the following response.
Don't linger on the specifics. You have a job to do here. Just get in there and do what needs to be done. We're all counting on you.
When asking about the princess and her morality, the narrator is even more vague. One quote in particular highlights this heavily, as well as the approach he takes throughout the entire game. When you ask whether she will end the world only because she was locked up in the first place, he will say,
while I appreciate the mental exercise, we are running up against a bit of a ticking clock. Nevertheless, let me assure you, the princess is locked up because she's dangerous. She is not dangerous because she's locked up. And before you decide to waste even more of our time by asking how I know that, let me suggest a more pragmatic lens through which to view this situation. Causality doesn't matter here, because the end result is the same no matter what led us up to this point. If the princess leaves the cabin, the world will end, and there is no changing that. It's no use arguing semantics over a metaphorical chicken or egg, because the egg is hatched and it's about to ruin everything.
From here you will know what kind of person you're dealing with. An absolute utilitarian with a bit of an ego issue who believes his word to be all-knowing truth, and simply to be the case without needing to give much justification. At this point, all you can do is either take his word that he's correct, due to the seemingly sudden nature of the situation of you being put in the middle of the woods and being told by a disembodied and possibly divine voice that you are destined for greatness, or reject his words due to his attitude, and risk the entire world and everyone who lives in it dying in the process. It's a really bad placement for you, the player, to be put in, and despite the seemingly heroic nature of the quest, it's hard to imagine doing any good in this scenario. However, that also begs the question, who are you playing as? When you get to the first loop of the game, which we'll get to what that means later, one of the questions you can ask is why you specifically need to slay the princess, and why the people who locked her up couldn't, to which he admits that you're special, and that we're the only person capable of doing this. So what the hell are we, or rather what are you playing as, to be more specific? That is a question that's saved for later. However, the idea that the character you play as being the only one who could possibly be fit for this role is heavily emphasized throughout the entire game. One common theme that emphasizes this includes how your character is repeatedly referred to as a hero, with the term hero being referenced in the name of the first chapter being the hero and the princess, the narrator referring to you as such multiple times, and the first voice that speaks, again, what that means, I'll explain in a bit, is called the voice of the hero. There are a lot of choices you can make with the hero and how it affects the story and gameplay. However, regardless on what you pick, the hero does what is expected of a hero to do, create an impact to the story and world around him. This could be slaying the princess, saving the princess, betraying the princess, giving to the princess, locking the princess away, etc, etc, etc. The situation that the hero finds himself in is just inherently complicated to the amoral situation he finds himself in, with the promise that if he doesn't, the world will end. This is something that is stated in the very opening of the game actually, that there are no wrong answers, only new beginnings. Of course, I should preface this by saying there still are generally immoral choices you can make, and that there are some achievement names in the game that will mock you at certain points jokingly, one example of this being called the Lady Killer, in which you kill the damsel iteration of the princess. Again, I'll explain this later. However, I still believe that the sentiment that there's no wrong choice stands true, at least to some degree. Every decision you make is within the realm of understandability and is placed within a morally gray area. This isn't for me to say that your choices throughout the game are meaningless, but rather to point out that the complexity of decisions, and even how in some of the most morbid of choices, there is some reason within it. It's all the actions of the hero at the end of the day, whether you pull the lever for the trolley or not. Now, I realize this is something that's going to leave a lot of people scratching their heads, because most often there has to be a wrong choice. Under normal circumstances, if the princess is good, and we kill her, then it's an action of evil, or at the very least the wrong choice. However, if the princess is evil, and we do nothing to stop her, then that is also the wrong choice, and maybe even the evil action depending on your perception. So, how do we work around this binary of options? Well, simple. It's not that simple. How the world of Slay the Princess operates is very akin to a living and breathing Schrodinger's cat experiment. What I mean by that is that within the Schrodinger's cat experiment, the question is to do with the hypothesis of an observable reality itself. As Schrodinger himself puts it, the psi function of the entire system would express this by having in it the living and dead cat, pardon the expression, mixed or spread out in equal parts. It is typical of these cases that an indeterminacy originally restricted to the atomic domain turns into essentially macroscopic indeterminacy, which can then be resolved by direct observation. This prevents us from so naively accepting a blurred model as representative of reality. Eugene Winger goes even further in this idea that reality doesn't even occur until the observer sees it by stating that all that quantum mechanics purports to provide are probability connections between subsequent impressions, also called apperceptions of the consciousness. And even though the dividing line between the observer whose consciousness is being affected and the observed physical object can be shifted towards one or the other to a considerable degree, it cannot be eliminated. While this specific idea is generally disregarded by a majority of modern-day quantum physicists, it's still an incredibly interesting concept, and the reason it applies is because the princess is purely warped by the perception of the character and you as the player. When you arrive at the cabin, you are given two choices. Pick up the blade on the table, or don't. When you pick up the blade, it can only be assumed that you have at least some form of trust in the narrator's words, and are at least a little bit cautious of the princess. When you don't pick up the blade, it could be assumed that the princess is essentially harmless, or you just aren't taking it seriously. Regardless, no matter what you pick, You end up being right because you perceived it as such. If you pick up the knife, the princess will respond in a somewhat hostile and closed manner, with the others describing her as cold and harsh. And if you don't pick it up, the princess is very open and happy to see you. This is the entirety of the game summed up in a single decision. The perception of the player and the hero influences how the princess is and behaves. Of course, the player doesn't realize this on their first playthrough, and especially not the hero character. So he's just going through the motions, doing what he thinks is right, and by technicality, being right as a result. This doesn't just apply to basic aspects of the princess's personality either. If we believe we truly slayed the princess, she's dead. If we believe she can overpower us, she can. If we believe she is innocent and can't even use a knife to stab us to death because we asked her properly, she is. You get the idea. Our perception is key, reality is an illusion, and the princess operates in a way that is beyond our understanding. However, if we perceive the princess in a specific way throughout the game, how does the princess perceive us as the player? There are a couple points within the game that the player actually has the ability to get a grasp on how they actually look. The first sign of this is when you grab the knife, you are able to see what your hand looks like, a dark talon-like appendage with claws extending from your fingers. Another is when at one point, you reach a mirror and you see an all-black figure bending down as they look towards their own reflection. And finally, when you're given the ability to literally see through the princess's perspective and see yourself towering over the princess with odd white eyes and intimidating presence. This paints a very bizarre picture, as it seems what the player is constantly playing as is this strange Birdman thing. While this is already weird for the person playing the game for the first time, this even goes as far as to shock the hero himself, as seen with some dialogue options. Despite how you would imagine the princess to feel, she never expresses this emotion to you throughout the game, unless directly asked about your appearance by her, to which she just states that you can't judge someone based on outside appearance, which is ironic due to the hero's perception literally changing the appearance of those of the princess. This does, however, give important insight on what the hero represents. Despite his seemingly hostile and scary appearance, beneath that face can be anything, from someone benevolent to actively malicious or simply just cold. Though, that statement may leave some wondering. We are stripped of our control from the hero himself. How would he behave and act? Well, it's honestly up to interpretation, though I do have one theory, the theory in question being tied to the voices. After every time you face the princess with you dying as some sort of result, the world resets and a new chapter with a specific name begins depending on your actions in the last run. Your actions also influence two other things: the appearance of the princess and the introduction of the new voice. This voice represents a specific emotion or trait that was heavily exhibited in the first chapter. While we'll get more into the specifics of what each of these voices are later on, and how they serve in the story, the important thing to note is that the voice of the hero almost immediately spawns after you walk towards the cabin in the beginning. In my view, there are two ways to look at how this happens. The first possibility is that the voice spawned as a result of the narrator talking to you in the beginning about saving the world. No matter how you interpret the speech and decide between the two choices, it's either saving the world or trying to protect the innocent, and either one of these is undeniably considered a heroic action. One fact that I think justifies this claim is that the voice of the hero tends to take a very wishy-washy approach, as he is just as overwhelmed by the moral dilemma presented by the narrator as much as the players are, as he is inherently trying to do the right thing from it just being in his nature, as representing the embodiment of heroism. The other interpretation, however, is that the voice of the hero is simply the external consciousness of the hero character you play as. I do believe that this is the interpretation of the hero that rings the most true, as despite being a benevolent force, he isn't completely flawless, as there are many times throughout the story where he will try and focus on self-preservation over what is particularly the heroic thing, as well as carry somewhat of a sarcastic tone with many of the other voices. However, there are also two counter-arguments that can be made towards this. The first one being that the voice's moments of self-preservation might actually be to try and save the hero, rather than himself as a concept. This can be argued to be the case near the end of the game, in which he launches the hero to the princess to possibly slay her, despite the possible risks of what may happen to him. The second counter-argument is that the other voices are simply bordering on intolerable, and being annoyed with them is a very normal response due to the sheer insanity and questionable morals of each one. Regardless of what the voice of the hero is, though, he is consistently the voice of reason for the player to listen to, and is kind, patient, gentle, reasonable, and frequently looking to do the moral thing in any given situation. However, he isn't the only influence on the player, because the other voices will still manifest depending on the action of the player/hero. There are many other voices, and although I will not go into every single one in depth, I am going to go over the basic summary of each one, and how they are summoned by the player in Chapter 2. I won't go over how you get them in Chapter 3 due to it being irrelevant to the conversation. The Broken appears when you get overpowered by the princess due to self-doubt during the initial fight between you and her. His personality is that of depression and submission to the princess who domineered over him. The Cheated appears when you slay the princess. However, question if she's actually dead, which leads to her pulling out a knife and stabbing you. His personality is that of spite and pessimism. The Cold appears when you slay the princess and simply leave her as is while disobeying the rest of the narrator's orders. His personality is that of little emotion and callousness. The Contrarian appears when you don't even enter the cabin to begin with and continue to refuse to do so, even when you keep reappearing in front of it. His personality is wanting to reject every single opinion just for the sake of a bit of fun. The Haunted appears when you don't pick up the knife in the beginning, however still and try and slay her only to die to her in the same process. His personality is that of an instinct for fear and survival. The Opportunist appears the same way as the Hunted, however you kill the princess in the process as well. His personality is that of a lying and amoral yes-man who is willing to do anything to gain more power in any situation. The Paranoid occurs when you decide to just lock the princess away in the basement, believing it's too much of a risk to do anything. His personality is similar to the Hunted, however much less pragmatic in his way of thinking and more cowardiceness. However, despite these traits, he's actually one of the more resourceful voices, as during the Nightmare chapter he is able to keep you alive simply by consciously repeating the names of your vital organs so you don't die of fear. The Skeptic appears when you pick up the knife, however decide to free the princess instead. His personality is that of questioning everything around him and the validity of what he sees, making him both the smartest of the voices as well as the narrator's biggest critic. Finally, the Stubborn appears when you pick up the knife and get into a fight with the princess that leads to both of your demises. His personality is that of a bloodthirsty maniac who is constantly ready to get back up and find an opponent. These are the voices throughout the game, and while each one does undeniably bring moments of intriguing storytelling, pragmatic usage, or just flat-out funny moments, they aren't really worth getting into, at least right now. Maybe another time if you would all like to see an update video with an analysis on each one of them, but that's up for the comments to decide. However, there is one more voice I didn't mention who I do want to talk about more extensively, as despite his incredibly silly and over-the-top character, he contributes a surprising amount to the overall themes and meaning of the game. I mentioned previously that Slay the Princess states in its very opening that there are no wrong choices and only new beginnings. However, another interesting thing that the opening mentions is that Slay the Princess is in fact a love story. What exactly this means is, again, for later. However, one character that highlights this fact, albeit in a very comedic and exaggerated way, is the voice of the Smitten. Webster Dictionary defines the term smitten as deeply affected or struck by strong feelings of attraction, affection, or infatuation, and to say that this is his character is an understatement. The way that you are able to get him in your ragtag group of internal voices in the beginning is by not picking up the knife, talking to the princess, agreeing to free her, overcoming the narrator's power over you, letting her take you out, and then dying with the next loop being when he shows up. The voice of the Smitten is based on the idea of the player being blindly devoted to nothing but saving the princess, to the point of using all of your willpower to overpower a pseudo-divine being and let yourself be stabbed to death. However, the Smitten himself can at best be described as the most loyal partner someone can ever have, and at worst be a stalker you need to move several states to get away from. I could truthfully make this entire section dedicated to things that the Smitten has said to show just how he acts. However, I'll show one quote, with his justification on why he would risk saving the princess over the world. He says,
"What can I say? A world without love is a world that isn't worth saving."
I've also hinted at the idea that the Smitten himself is incredibly unstable, or at least dangerous due to me calling him a stalker. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, for one, if you decide to slay the princess with the Smitten around in Chapter 2, who at this point would be known as the damsel, accompanied with a more submissive and gentle personality to accompany your innocent view of her, he will force you to kill yourself, causing yet another loop to Chapter 3. So, devotion is the only thing on the Smitten's mind, which begs the question, what happens if the princess were to reject him? Under normal circumstances, she wouldn't. As mentioned previously, the damsel has a very submissive personality, and will just go with whatever you as the player suggest, including the murder. However, there is one thing that the damsel wants for herself, and it's to leave the cabin. One of the possible routes in the damsel chapter was actually added in a later update for the game, known as the Pristine Cut. Before this update, there were 3 primary routes you can take: saving the princess, which leads to the two of you escaping before leading to a true reset, which I'll explain that soon; deconstructing the princess, which will confuse her and begin to alter her into nothing but a literal cardboard cutout; and slaying the princess, which will lead you to the iteration of Chapter 3 known as The Burned, in which she murders you. The newly added 4th route is where things get interesting. It's done by suggesting the princess and you can stay in the cabin after the voice of the hero suggests it, due to the repeated implication that her staying in the cabin is what seemingly keeps the world safe. At first, she's hesitant, and very much prefers to leave despite your suggestion, but still goes along with it reluctantly. Due to the Smitten being worried about the princess not being happy with the suggestion, and thinking that it's the narrator's influence on the place, he states that,
No, it has to be him. It has to be this place. If we just made these walls more fitting for a princess, if we just say the right things, if we just showed her the contents of our heart, she'd be happy here.
He then proceeds to force the hero to rip open his own chest. This, understandably, ends up with the princess being confused and scared. However, during the process, he says,
Don't mind my sacrifice. It's a fair price to pay to give her everything she doesn't know she wants.
The princess then realizes that he's...
Oh, I see. You're trying to tell me something.
and that...
It's beautiful.
This then leads to you dying, and instead of the game taking you to Chapter 3 like it usually would, it resets to an epilogue, simply known as Happily Ever After. Within this new epilogue, instead of starting on the forest per usual, you are placed in the cabin, which is now decorated as a luxurious castle that the 2 characters seemingly live in. In fact, it's so luxurious that the stairs described by the narrator, who usually describes the negatives and flaws of said stairs in order to justify slaying the princess by saying it would be probably doing her a favor, can only think to describe the niceness of it, and is thrown off. When greeting the princess once again, you see a tall shadow standing over her, who she describes as whispering sweet nothings in her ear, and just wanting the 2 of them to be happy. If you are able to get the voice of the skeptic in this run, you are able to deduce that the shadow is actually the voice of the Smitten. He repeatedly gives the 2 games, food, and other activities, before the 2 grow more and more bored, with even the narrator starting to feel genuine pity for the 2 of them, admitting that it's an awful experience. If you accept that neither of you are happy in this place, the shadow representing the Smitten vanishes, as what he was trying to do in the first place failed. From this point, you can slay the princess, with even the narrator feeling regret and remorse for this action, or you can leave, with the narrator deciding to let you go, as he decides it's the right thing to do. The narrator's revelation here is quite interesting. However, one of the most fascinating things about this chapter is just what the Smitten embodies here. It's a misguided attempt to try and force happiness with what limited resources the 2 have, and to try and make the 2 work rather than simply eliminating the obvious issue of the 2 desperately wanting to leave the cabin. The entirety of the Happily Ever After epilogue is a representation of toxic positivity and arguably an abusive relationship due to the control that the Smitten had over the princess, with her trying to convince herself that she is happy. I'm not really sure whether the Smitten had good intentions in his heart or not, if he genuinely wanted to bring the 2 closer together and try and make them as happy as humanly possible, or if he was just wanting some form of an ego trip, believing that he should be the one who gets loved and those who don't accept his love need to learn to accept it. What I do know, though, is that he believed it was for a good intention, and that he was making the 2 happy, but his way to do so was by ironically making the 2 incredibly unhappy in the process. It brings us back to the trolley problem mentioned earlier, or rather the question of double effect, to be more specific. In a footnote for Philippa Foot's article, the doctrine of double effect is defined as an algorithm for solving all moral disputes in which an act will have two effects, one good and the other bad. The doctrine says, roughly, that it is always wrong to do a bad act intentionally in order to bring about good consequences, but that it is sometimes permissible to do a good act despite knowing that it will bring about bad consequences. Referring back to Philippa Foot, after she brought up her famous hypothetical, she stated that the distinction between direct and oblique intention is crucial here, and is of great importance in an uncertain world. Nevertheless, this is no way to defend the doctrine of double effect. For the question is whether the difference between aiming at something and obliquely intending it in itself is relevant to moral decisions, not whether it is important when correlated with a difference of certainty in the balance of acting good. If the Smitten truly ended up doing good, but was only intending to do it for selfish gains, would that have been evil? It's hard to say, as it isn't even made clear what his exact intentions were, only that his methods led to misery of both the hero and the princess, trapping them in an endless loop of boredom and depression, never leading anywhere. A cycle that was so bad it even made the narrator rethink his philosophy and change his mind about the princess, which I haven't really mentioned his philosophy and reasoning up until now, or even just why he genuinely wants us to slay the princess. So the question is just, why? To answer that, I previously mentioned the idea of a true reset, but I didn't clarify exactly what I meant by this. After every third chapter or dead end of a second chapter, the princess and you are taken away to a strange void, in which she is pulled from you by tens if not hundreds of limbs reaching out for her and pulling her into nothing. In this void you can no longer hear the narrator, and when you approach a mirror in the center, the voices you've grown accustomed to vanish as well. Soon you find the princess again, held by the limbs and made to talk through the voice of a divine entity who thanks you for the vessel and the new perspectives. When you ask her what she is, she admits that she doesn't know, but that she is both simultaneously was, is not, and was not the princess all at the same time, even if she doesn't understand herself. The voice asks you to bring her more perspectives, so that she may be whole, and with these new perspectives, she'll gain a new sense of wonder and introspectiveness on the world that she is seemingly birthed into. It's kept very vague what much of this means until the fifth time you do one of these resets, or, in her words, bring her a vessel, being another iteration of the princess, in which instead of seeing her, you look into the mirror, and you see an entity representing the narrator.
I think you know what I am.
And here, the mirror shatters, but you can ask the narrator, or rather the entity that he is, what is going on. You have a limited amount of questions, but if you ask the right ones, you are able to find out the following information. The hero is a godlike being representing a concept that is simply known as the Long Quiet, who is split in half from another concept that is known as the Shifting Mound, also known as the Princess. The narrator is a ghostly echo of the man who created him as being responsible for the splitting of the two concepts, as his reasoning was for the sheer purpose of stopping death itself. The Shifting Mound is stated to be the representation of every single probable change that can occur, every death, every crime, every tragedy, and the end of the universe as a whole, but also every positive change that can result too. The only one who can actually stop the Shifting Mound from any of this would be you. If you are able to, the universe will be put into a state of eternal life and harmony, however at the expense of nothing ever changing and the universe staying the same for all of eternity. The narrator states that he did this so he could save all his loved ones, However, he ironically had to take his own life in order to enact the strange complex that the hero and the princess find themselves in, to either trap her for all of eternity or to end death as a concept forever. So, that was a lot of information, and I wouldn't be surprised if you are a little confused hearing all of this. What initially seems to be a game about slaying a princess is eventually spiraled into a game about a madman who is willing to bring an end to death itself and create constructs of gods in order to do so. However, this is only the direction that the game could go in, considering everything up to at this point. The loops, the voices, the princess changing shape and personality depending on perspective, the giant bird you play as, all of it is foreshadowing for the greater picture that's being set up. All of it ties back to the narrator, though, who is not only willing to bring an end to the life of a princess to save everyone in the universe, but to bring an end to change as a whole. I stated before that the narrator has an ego issue, and I still do think that it's the case that he can be borderline narcissistic and even cruel throughout the game, but I would never call him evil. Unlike the Smitten, where I can't tell whether his intent was truly good or not, I fully believe that the narrator did everything he did out of the sheer altruism in his heart. Not only did he sacrifice his own life in order to save others, as he previously mentioned, but he is also willing to change his mind if you show him the error of his ways. That's why he gets so moved during the happily ever after epilogue, because he realizes that what the Smitten was doing would have just been what he would have achieved. A world where no happiness occurs, no positive change happens, and all anyone can do is just play the same board game over and over again. While he doesn't remember any of this during the part where you question him and thinks it's absurd that he changed his mind, it still does speak volumes about him as a person. I haven't mentioned this previously, but when you successfully slay the princess in Chapter 1, you are promised a reward, with that reward being eternal, blissful immortality gifted to the player in an empty void. While this is seen as horribly cruel and unusual to the voices that you have, the ending does recontextualize this as something that he genuinely thought would be a reward, as more than anything, he was a man who wanted to try and gift people something beyond death. Now, again, I do want to clarify what the narrator did to try to do was still ultimately misguided. However, any of us would have likely tried to do the same thing if we were in his position. Death is a horrific concept. It's something that all of us want to avoid, but it gives us meaning. When we are limited by mortality, we are able to see the beauty in things more, and it makes every moment that we are alive all the more special. In a way, death in itself is our own very trolley problem, or double effect. As yes, there is so much evil and sadness to come from the idea. However, at the same time, there's a limitless amount of meaning that spirals from these concepts. The narrator was just scared of the possibilities that lay past the beyond, and wanted to do everything he can to protect those around him. So despite all his flaws, his narcissism, his lack of perspective, his pseudo-godhood, I genuinely believe he was a good man who wanted nothing more than happiness for everyone. However, not even he could escape death, as when you discover the truth and the meaning of everything around you, the narrator shatters, leaving you to speak with the princess. The shifting mound section of the game is both simultaneously horrific as well as oddly divine. You see the recognizable face of the princess everywhere, an infinite number of versions of the princess spread across the environment as you talk to the center, who is called the shifting mound. After giving her 5 vessels, she was able to complete her form and see herself throughout an infinite number of possibilities, infinite perspectives, infinite lifetimes that she has experienced. She is given a new philosophy that life is fueled by the experiences, changes, meaning, everything that causes change to occur. The princess asks you to join her in this new philosophy and become rulers of the cosmos in space and time. If you deny her, she will use your previous experiences to convince the hero more of this philosophy that she believes in before you're able to make your choice. It becomes clear that any squabble that the two of you have had from trying to kill each other in past runs is completely lost on her, and that she only just wants to be with you. In her eyes, all of the pain that you have caused her only helped to give herself meaning, much like how she gives the universe meaning by being the embodiment of death. However, she still is causing evil, even if for a greater cause, a true definition of double effect. the worst evils for the greatest goods, much like the narrator. However, that's the way it's always been, and forever will be, because it gives everyone meaning, and without this meaning there's nothing. At the same time though, it makes some wonder if there isn't another way from this. Something that gives meaning but with less death and less destruction. Though she rejects this perspective, because despite being a god about possibilities and different perspectives, she believes that this is the only way. From this point on, there are multiple endings that you can choose to complete the game. Whether it's to slay her completely and bring an end to change, join her in ascendance, etc. However, I want to talk about my favorite ending to the game. As for me personally, I believe that it's thematically the true ending to the entire game. During one part of the exchange, you are able to talk with the voice of the hero again, who you are able to ask for help to get to the center of her, with the possibility of putting a stop to her. As you do this, you enter the cabin once again, becoming more and more distorted as you go forward, before going back to the basement just to see the princess, by herself. You can slay her if you want, but you have the option to just choose not to, as by this point, you're not even sure if you want to kill her. You just don't want to see any more death, or destruction, or chaos. She even admits that in this more relaxed form, she's not even sure if she wants to be a god. There are two choices from here if not to kill her. Either go through an eternal loop of the game's story, starting back with no memory and continuing for all eternity, or leaving together through the door. These are two beings of death and destruction, with an infinite amount of power and knowledge. However, in this form they're just people. So if they walk through that door, into the infinite cosmos in their normal forms, what happens? The two of them decide to take a chance, and much like the game suggested by saying it was a love story, the two hold hands, deciding to see where it takes them, not knowing what's ahead. The story of Slay the Princess is about death, perspective, and the subjectivity of morality. The world is horrible and scary, but at the same time, there are so many wonderful and beautiful things that come out of it as well. It's a strange paradox of a world full of evil leading to so much good, and a world full of good leading to so much evil. It's all just perspective, all a different way of looking at things and how they affect us personally. The princess, or the shifting mound, is a representation of all of this. Before she gained new perspective, she was only limited to a simple form, limited to the experiences of her own life, much like how all of us are. But she still was someone who believed in growth and change, and gaining new perspectives and insights in order to be better, though at the same time, this chaos blinded both her and the narrator, the former refusing to see any of the chaos that she was causing, while with the narrator refusing to see any of the eternal limbo he was causing. It's a situation where no one really wins completely. However, it shouldn't mean that we just give up. Sure, we shouldn't just take an absolutist approach and go out and take out every single negative thing in our path, but we should at least strive and try to make the world better in the process, much like how they tried in the end. There's a strange beauty in that contradiction, about how death gives us meaning, but how we shouldn't let it define us, and how that we need to find a balance in order to stay alive, but without staying too complacent with the world. A love story in the sense, between the two concepts, where they are equal. That is what I think makes the benevolence of Slay the Princess so fascinating. Thank you to everyone who's still watching. It really does mean the most that you're still around by the end of this video. And please, if you enjoyed it, give it a subscribe, a like, and possibly a comment on who you want to see next. And have a good day. Thank you.